everyone. Welcome to another exciting session of Lambda Test XP webinar series. Through XP series, we dive into a world of insights and innovation featuring renowned industry experts and leaders in the testing and quality engineering ecosystem. I'm Kavya, Director of Product Marketing at Lambda Test, and it's a pleasure to have you all join us today. So today's session is on Dassault Systems, a global technology leader known for its collaborative platforms that accelerate product innovation across life sciences, manufacturing, and engineering. At Dassault System, expert quality assurance teams drive software reliability through rigorous test engineering, advanced automation, and continuous quality monitoring. So today we are hosting Brian Goulet, Senior Manager of Test Engineering at Dassault Systems. Welcome to the webinar, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So, a quick introduction for Brian. So, with over 15 years of experience in testing, including a decade of innovations at Dassault Systems and 5 formative years at Paraxel, his professional journey is marked by work on high-performing teams which are committed to delivering high quality, compliant, and groundbreaking technology to the life sciences sector. So we are today honored to welcome Brian, whose expertise promises to, really throw a lot of light into today's discussion with real-world strategies and best practices. He'll, of course, also showcase on how real-world challenges that he encountered and what were the innovative solutions that he's sort of worked on. So before we move on to the questions, right, Brian, why don't you share a bit about your journey in the software testing space?
Yeah, sure. So again, thanks for having me. This is great to be here, and I hope I can live up to deliver some of those things that you mentioned and give everybody some good insights. So I'm like so many people who kind of fell into software testing, right? I started out in mechanical engineering, and then I spent some time in Romania helping some people out, doing some mission work there. And then it was time to come back and start the real world, basically, the longer term plan for my life. So I tried to get a job in engineering, and I wasn't finding it. And so I expanded my scope of searching and first landed in a painting job that didn't pay enough. So I had to search further and and because the work that I had done in mechanical engineering is a lot about testing. It was in manufacturing then too. And what they'd had me do was run some tests on their process to see where they were having quality problems. And so I would devise different mechanical type tests to just figure out what was wrong with their quality. And so I think this translated really well into the software world. So when I went to the engineering, to the interview for the software engineering test role, then they were asking me questions about how to test things, and my brain started going, and I was able to translate um, from the mechanical world into the software world well enough that they took a risk on me. It was still a risk, right? But I think that's what happened with so many of us that we got a job in testing was somebody took a risk on us. And what I love about that is it brings so many different perspectives into the software space. And I love that you can translate so much of life and what we do um, into the testing world. And so I think it's just a wonderful industry in that way. But that's kind of how I got into it and started back in Excel at that testing job.
A very interesting career trajectory, Brian, and of course, have you pivoted, from so many different career charts into testing. That's pretty impressive, and I think rightfully said so. People have taken risk on you, which, of course, has led you here. Awesome. So let's start with the first question that we have for you, which is what challenges do teams specifically face in balancing automated testing with deep manual test coverage? And how does this impact defect rates reported by customers?
Yeah, thank you. This is a good question because it gets right into the heart of what I wanted to share. But the basic uh, problems that people have is first knowing what the right balance is, and then also how to achieve that balance. So the main idea is that we want to have testing coverage that's thorough and effective, right? Which should include some smart and useful automation that's done quickly in order to leave time for us to explore manually, to put human eyes on the system to see what the user will see, right? And so the next, once you understand what the right mix is for you, and we can talk about that a little bit more and later, but the next thing is to figure out how to get there. So being able to achieve the right balance is the next struggle that people have. And for this, I think we can look at where people normally land and why. And I think oftentimes, it may not be the case for everyone, but oftentimes we have developers who just want to write code. And to get them to write a test is a struggle. Anything beyond a unit test, forget about it. And so sometimes you get into those situations where developers are at best writing some unit tests. And what this can mean is that they're not really covering the acceptance criteria. They're not thinking through what the use cases are for the user. They're not doing business driven development or test driven development for acceptance criteria. So oftentimes what that means is their code just doesn't do what it should. It's either incomplete or it's incorrect. So what we want to do is we want to cover that gap quickly, right? Have the automation in place, and if you can have the developers give you that good code right up front that's tested, it reduces some cycles between dev and test. But really more importantly, it gives the testers a lot more time to be able to explore the app and do the more complicated workflows that the users will actually encounter in the real world when they're trying to do their tasks. And so that's where this all comes together is how do we get ourselves to a place where we're covering the automated tests quickly that do the baseline and then allow the testers to really pave the way for the users in the real world.
Thanks, Brian. It's pretty interesting because you've thrown in quite a bit of insights into it. I think it also highlights how balance isn't about doing more of everything, but also doing the right kind of test, for instance, right type of testing, for instance. And I think a lot of these, it also depends upon how teams are basically listening to the customers, for instance, because that influences the customer experience again at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure.
And how do QA teams at Dassault Systems decide when to use automation versus um, manual testing or exploratory testing to catch potential defects before release? Is there like a framework that you have in place which you have made for the team at large?
Yeah, pretty much. What we try and do is automate everything that we can, but more just focused on the acceptance criteria. So if it's something that's automatable, we try and have the developers do that. And actually, that's the way we do it in our team, is we have the developers writing the acceptance criteria tests. Um, Now, there's some things you don't automate there when it's difficult to test with automation because of the technology that you're using. That would be one thing. But also, you want to be very cautious about automating things that are complicated workflows, things that string together because they can be, can lead to bloat in your test suite, and it can also be brittle. It can not surface the information you need quickly. Like, say, for instance, you have a workflow and you go from A to B and then you go to C and then you go to D, right? Do you do a test that goes all the way from A through to D? I think that's a less helpful because anything along there could break and probably will, right? Murphy's Law. But then if you can break that down into, test that goes from A to B, and then another test that goes from B to C, and then from, C to D, because then you can also write a test. What if you can also get to D from A? So then you'll have another test from A to D. So those singular paths you can do. Whereas if you were going to try and string all those different workflows together and then back, you could have basically an infinite number of tests and combinations that you would have to write. And you can't just crush that with AI and automation. You have to be a little bit more smart about what the customer needs are. And so the basic rule is let's automate all of the acceptance criteria, the explicit ones and the assumed ones. And the assumed ones, I just mean that they might not be written explicitly in the requirements, but they're born out of an understanding of the environment that they're in. So everybody knows that you have to have this thing there. We don't have to write it every time. So those things you have built tests for. Um, so hopefully that helps. It's I don't know if it's a formula so much as a guideline, but that's where we try and shoot.
No, absolutely. I think it sounds like a framework to start off with when it comes to decision making. And also, it's like a reminder that it's not automation versus manual testing, but rather figuring out which approach is basically working best in certain situations. And I think
Mhm.
what also makes it interesting is how you have mentioned about, automate anything that's possible for automation, as long as it's possible, right?
Right.
Very interesting. And I think this would be also a great insight for leaders who are basically trying to figure out where to invest their time and effort into, because most of the leaders who are working in quality engineering leaders, such as yourself, who are working in enterprises and are dealing with large scale projects, for instance, they might want to figure out where to best put their effort into and how. So yeah, pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple
Uh,
of things you mentioned there.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to jump in on. Yeah, you mentioned about like it's not manual or exploratory.
Yeah.
And just kind of like some of the background, our leadership has been both sides and very, very rarely in the middle on this
Hmm.
issue. So I've seen some different waves come across our company that I get to speak to a little bit, and we get to so I'll introduce that concept a little bit now. Some of the leadership come in and says we've got to automate everything, and then some of the leadership, some of the names that you mentioned before when we were talking, James Bach and that company they like to do the exploratory testing. They we had leadership who were very much in that camp. They said let's really enhance our exploratory testing, and then they wouldn't say no. Don't get me wrong. They wouldn't say don't do automated testing, but really they wanted to highlight the value of the exploratory testing, and so that's really what the focus was for that leadership phase. And so um, we're really seeing both sides back and forth and then back again. And really what it turns out is that we've had to sort of sort out what the value is of each one and how to make it just do the right one. So when we say automate everything, we don't want to spend a lot of time trying to improve or to make an automated test that it really has no business being automated, in the sense that it's going to take too long to actually write it, or it's going to not add value, or it'd be way easier to do manual. You don't need to do it every time. So there are many reasons why not to automate a test. And I think you just got to hold to those um, and understand what those cases are. Yeah.
Oh, very well put, of course. Thank you. So moving on to the next question, how can integrating manual and automated testing approaches also lead to improved defect detection and prevention in real world projects?
Yeah. This is I think been really central to what has driven down we have customer reported defects. And so having the right mix and use of automation and manual testing can make sure that you're covering your acceptance criteria, first of all, and that you have the more complicated workflows really put to the test, right? So they're different in nature because the acceptance criteria are checking the box. This is what it should do, and all things are rainbows and sunshine, right? Um, and acceptance criteria can certainly cover some of the negative cases as well. Um, but what you have in the real world is something that's far more complicated, It's humans making human mistakes and then trying to recover from that in the worst possible way that you would never have thought. And so all of those types of things are things that you really need to try and work out in exploratory testing. And so there's a whole range of if you're not seeing the value of what exploratory testing is, maybe it's something that you should focus on. We don't have time to go over like the key points of how to do exploratory testing well. But if you're running out of ideas there, just know that there are many, many more ideas that can help. And so giving yourself the time to explore those things is really important part of doing that. And so as far as like determining for each project what you might need to do, because that's important when deciding what the right mix is. Um, just a note a little bit about the different applications and what their needs might be. So if you have an application that has, and you can think for yourself like what your application does, if it has tightly controlled workflows, then it might require less manual exploratory testing because you might be able to really, get most of the way there with your automated test. Just crush the combinations and you're good because you've controlled the workflows enough that there won't be many places for them to fall through. Now, if you're on the other hand, if your application is has more freedom for what the users can do and what input they can have, then that might require more exploratory testing. And then there's another way to look at it too is if your application has a clear silo of what an individual can work with. So they're working on their own personal data, for example, then you might not need as much exploratory testing. But if you have like a lot of objects or data that's interacted by many users and they're all interacting in different ways, then you might need more exploratory testing in general for your application. So understanding what your application is can really help guide you into knowing what the right mix of manual and automated testing should be, and then give you something to aim for. And then having that right mix is really just about I've covered everything uh, in an efficient way um, so that you can find the bugs before the customers do. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Again, a great point because it also makes me wonder how this integration piece is often overlooked in certain ways at certain times because as you were mentioning earlier, right, people either tend to choose one of the testing approaches, for instance, rather than mixing this. And a lot of times when both approaches have been sort of working in tandem, I think that's when the teams are able to, uncover the risk or say even release it with much more confidence, make the releases with much more confidence, it seems.
Yeah, for sure.
So, moving on to the next question, what metrics or feedback do Dassault System QA teams use to measure the effectiveness of their testing mix and adjust as projects evolve? Of course, you mentioned briefly about choosing the right, choosing the right approach, but I'm sure that the audience would be curious to know if there are any metrics that you have in place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned, defects that are found in production that we call customer reported defects. And this is really one of the most important things that we track. We want to find the bugs before the customers did find them. Because if we can find them, hopefully early on in the development cycle, it's easier. I mean, I think people are aware that the cost goes down the earlier you find it, the cost to fix it. Once a customer has found it, it's more costly and more problematic. Um, so if you find a bug, and whether it's a big bug or a small bug, a very important one or an insignificant one, at least you have the information to make decisions on that early to say, okay, this is one that I don't think customers will find. If they do, they'll be able to easily work past it. Right. But regardless of what kind it is, any customer reported defect, we take back and we analyze and we try and determine what we can do to test for things like that to make sure that we're finding those things first. So that's a big important thing that we built into the process. Another thing that we track is like just the full count of existing defects out there. We're trying to make sure that we fix as many as we put out, or ideally more, right? So that our system is consistently getting better. Um, and I kind of mentioned, every time we find a bug as we're developing it, whether it's, we find it and it already exists in production, we just found it before the customers do, or we find it as part of our work that we're developing. We have a triage meeting that meets regularly, and they evaluate whether the bug is important to be fixed or not. But all of these different touch points with the bugs and looking at them in different levels is really helpful for us to feed that back into our testing loop to see, like, what are the trends, what are the kinds of bugs that are getting through either in the development process or into, the customer's awareness, and what can we do to fix that? Because quality isn't just on the tester side. Sometimes the quality issues we have are development issues, and sometimes they're product issues. We're not defining stories properly. We're not building them properly. We're not finding the issues early enough. So we want to take a holistic look at that. And those are the metrics that we use to really help us determine um, what what kind of trends we need to fix. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, you thank you for laying that out so well because I like how you have emphasized not just on metrics, but also on the need for a holistic approach when it comes to testing and not of course it is, as you said, as you rightly said, it's not just the tester's responsibility anymore, but also I think every part of the software, everyone who's working in the entire SDLC cycle is responsible for it at the end of the day.
As much as I don't like metrics, uh, because I don't like them when they're just used as a metric, but really
Mhm.
they should be the start of a conversation. And so that's what I'm trying to highlight here is that, we use different things and other companies use different things. And if it's not just the start of a conversation, then it's probably being misused. So, yeah.
No, great, of course. And I think it's also about, the need to sort of refine your quality strategy as you go and also make sure that you get like faster feedback, for instance. And for that, I think metrics are an important, criteria for it, or like um, more or less like it does give you more insights into a more matured, I think, quality engineering practice at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, metrics that can feed directly into improvements, that's the right kind of
Mhm.
metric. Yeah.
Great. So, moving on to the next question, what key challenges and benefits do teams encounter when shifting from manual heavy testing to an automation focused strategy?
Well, this is a big question, right? There are lots of challenges that people can have in moving from
Mhm.
into a into automation focused strategy. And we talked a lot about having a right balance, right? And so here we're assuming that, like, okay, you've discovered that you've got the wrong balance. You've got too much manual heavy testing. So you're not able to get to those deeper exploratory testing because all you're doing is the manual exploratory testing of the manual testing of the acceptance criteria, for example. That's taking too long. So in that case, you want to automate more of the acceptance criteria so you can spend more time in doing the manual exploratory testing. So in this case, like, first view should be like the first challenge, I think, is the mindset, having the right mindset of the end goal. So the shift shouldn't really be from away from manual testing towards automation testing. It should be, let's do the right kind of automation testing so that we have time to do the right kind of manual testing. So I think that's one of the key challenges that people have in organizations when they say they see the problem, they've got too many manual tests, it's too slow, but they see the goal as automate everything. And so I think they need to first shift that mindset. So that being said, when you're going to move to that, um, you have to know what the effective test suite looks like. And some of the things that we talked about before are like, what are the right kinds of tests to automate? So that's a good thing to keep in mind. But then also, you definitely do not want to translate your manual tests directly into automated tests because manual tests are built like user workflows and they string lots of things together because a human can absorb that kind of thing and deal with problems as they come. But automated tests are brittle and they don't have the observability built in like a person walking through it step by step, right? Who knows exactly where the problem was, right? Because they put in the data 4 steps back and now it's wrong. So this is why you want to build your test suite differently than you had written your automated or your manual tests. So um, and then another problem is automating too little. Of course, this is already what you've discovered when you're trying to move from too many manual tests to more automated tests, but you want to make sure that you're covering the acceptance criteria at least, right? So if you've done a lot of customer user workflows, um, then you might be tempted to make those your requirements that you automatically test. But it's good to go back and review what the acceptance criteria are for the stories and the low level rules and make sure that the system is functioning as it's intended for each one of those individual cases, down to like, is the button disabled when it should be, right? Make some tests for that. Now it'll be highlighted appropriately in a longer workflow that you might have had a manual test, but you just want to nail that one down and then move on to the other requirements, for example. Um, and then one more thing I'd say is that a lot of what I'm pushing towards is having these acceptance criteria tests written um, at the beginning,
Mhm.
and then move from there onto the manual tests. I really like the model where the developers are writing these acceptance criteria tests. Um, Having them have ownership over it has been really valuable for our team, and a couple reasons for that is because the um, the developers own that part of the quality process. They have to do like the business driven development for it. So they're handing better code over to the testers for that reason. And it's saving a lot of time for the testers, covering things that are just checkboxes so that they can do what humans are better at and doing human type things that humans will do in the real world. And so that's what you want to do is the test should cover the automation for the application acceptance criteria, and then the manual test should be, people trying to be people and seeing what people see. And so if you can if you can set that out as a goal or a stipulation to say like, okay, we're going to move, but what we want to do is have developers write these acceptance criteria tests so that not that we like back to the beginning, the mindset of like the end goal is not so that we don't do any manual testing, but so that we're doing the kind of manual testing that's effective and that's important for our customers. So yeah, so those are some of the pitfalls and challenges I think that to keep in mind.
No, excellent perspective, Brian. I think it also shows that, again, what you highlighted at the beginning of the conversation, right? While moving towards automation, it does brings its own challenges with it, but also figuring out the long-term benefits when it comes to scalability, I think, and repeatability and so on. I think one thing that definitely also that you highlighted was the shifting mindset, the aspect of shifting mindset, and also about how effective a testing suite should look like at the end of the day. So, just out of curiosity, I've also wanted to figure out, personally, you must have worked on hundreds of projects at Dassault, right? Is there any specific aspect that stands out, or like a learning that you had when you specifically faced a challenge while moving from a manual heavy testing to an automation focused strategy? Was there a specific, very specific challenge that you encountered?
Oh, interesting. So I have to go back to Par Excel really more
Hmm.
to leverage those kind of examples because when I came um, to Dassault Systems, which I work for the metadata brand at Dassault Systems.
Hmm.
Um, they had this process in place already, and so it was wonderful to see the switch, but, because we were doing a lot of manual testing at, ParExcel, um, and so I guess we were trying to do some changeover from the manual testing to the automated testing, and I think that's where that's where I really learned the challenge there was in in learning how to write the tests differently than the way we had written them for manual testing. So it was so easy to just say, like, we want to convert this test over to be an automated test. And so we tried that and we failed miserably because it was too brittle. It just wouldn't run all the way through. We could never get it to pass. And so our whole test suite failed because it was only one automated test and it wouldn't pass because there were too many complicated things in it, right? So we learned quickly that we had to break that down into smaller parts. Then so that's one of the main things that we learned. But then um, I think trying to think of other lessons that I would have learned in that challenge there. I think um, when you do the manual testing, I think you have a good uh, understanding of what proper testing. Maybe not. I don't know. There were certain requirements that you had to do when doing a manual test. Like if the step was wrong, you would have to properly mark it and initial any changes for minor changes, larger changes you'd have to handle. So all those kinds of process things that were ingrained at the manual level, and the reason why you had to do those things I'm in a very regulated environment, and so all those things had to be very specifically controlled. But even if it's not in a regulated environment, the the reasons why you're doing the test are a little bit more applicable when you're writing the manual test than the automated test. I think that the challenge when moving to automated is, oh, it's so fast, you can just automate it, and you get into the cases where you can have test bloat because you don't understand why you're writing the test. Is it really an important test? Does it add value? Right. And so then you have to get into like equivalence partitioning. Like if I do this test with the number one and I do the test with the number two, have I learned anything important? Or are those basically the same code path and the same risk? And so I think that's another challenge that you have when moving to a more automated setup is that you can lose sight of the fact that it is actually important to only be running automated tests that have value. Uh, so that's especially important now as we're getting into the AI world and how code is building code. And so I can see mountains and mountains of tests that don't have any value, slowing down test suites and backing up reporting frameworks and all that kind of thing. So yeah, just to come back to one of those phases where, the leadership in our company said we want to automate everything. And I landed in a team in Dassault Systems that had automated everything pretty well. And so we were wondering, well, what else do they want us to automate? Um, because at the time we were already dealing with the fact that our test suite report output was too large and it was breaking other systems where we had to place the report. And so we're dealing with those kinds of, we're already too big. Why would we want to make it bigger? How do we start to trim this down so we're running it more efficiently? And it's taking 2 hours to run the whole test suite, but that's too long. We want faster, you know. So initially it might seem like there's a lot of room to grow, and the test suite is very short at first, but if your project's going to last for any length of time and grow in complexity and size, then you have to be careful with the bloat. Make sure that you're handling the future. You will thank you when you consider test bloat. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Brian, and of course, great insights. I think it's always interesting thing when we go back into our professional journey and figure out what we learned. And I think what you shared was definitely very insightful. One thing that I've also often read about the source system is that, for instance, when it comes to a couple of advisory and analyst firm reports, right, they've always acknowledged the product leadership, the industry strength, as well as, of course, the customer experience that the Dassault is able to sort of provide, as an organization. So it's interesting to know that, the frameworks that you mentioned, the kind of, guidelines that they had in place, the kind of strategies that the quality assurance teams at Dassault has put in also probably contributes to what we are reading, right? I mean, outside of the organization, when we read about the source system, I think a lot of what you said also contributes to the strength the platform has been, the organization has been displaying.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to think so, that we're doing some things right and it's having a
Hmm.
positive impact. So for sure, we've seen that in the customer reported defects. So I can't take too much credit for this because it's a full team effort. But over the last
Hmm.
3 years, I put some metrics together. Over the last 3 years, each of the last 3 years, our customer reported defects has been going down. And so I started wondering, well, why is this happening? And so I think it's because we put this mix together where we have the acceptance criteria tested and we
Hmm.
are we've had focus on making sure we have enough automated tests, and we've had leadership that's come and help us focus on how to do exploratory testing really well. And
Yeah.
so, when you put those two together in the right way, then I think that's what you see, is you see customer reported defects starting to go down. And so that's why I wanted to share. So,
No,
yeah.
very impressive. Great job, of course. I think one question that has come up is also, or how can organizations at scale like the SOF, for instance, embrace AI? Is there anything specific that you might want to share with the audience on that particular question?
Yeah. So AI's been I've seen other companies maybe adopt AI faster than we have. Certainly, one of the main considerations is security. Like you're
Hmm.
gonna have to get the security right. Make of course, companies don't want to give away their code to AI companies, so you have to make sure that that's one of the things that took us a little while is to make sure that that was safe. And then we've had some attempts, I think, like most people have, at trying to see where AI is going to be valuable. And each different project is going to have their own specifics. And it's really related to what kind of data they can make available. And I think we're oftentimes using the same kind of data, similar bug reporting systems and similar code-based systems and, similar IDEs and things like that. So it's all pretty common. The data is out there, and we're starting to get that available to AI when it's secure. Um, and it's just a process of learning, you know, what this new relationship looks like because we have a kind of a relationship with AI. And so we have to try it and we have to experiment with it to see where it's actually valuable. And, you know, if people haven't tried it, from what I've seen, it's kind of spotty results and you have to be careful with what you prompt it with. And so there's this whole kind of prompt engineering concept that's a real thing. You can ask it for things and get bad information, and then you ask it slightly different, and it seems like it's got the best information in the world, which doesn't give me a lot of confidence when I think, I'm going to ask it the next thing. Who knows what I'm going to get? Is it a good question or not? So, in all of these things, I'm trying to go back to say, like, there's certainly that principle of having the human in the loop, and that's just been one that's really hit home for a lot of people, I think. And what it means is that I compare the output of AI to what the human would have done. The human is the standard. I think a lot of people are comparing AI to this AI to that model, to seeing what seems like a pretty good result, but really stack that up against what you would have actually done as a human and see where it gets you. And I think that's where if you can consistently show that it's adding value over what a human would have done, then I think that's good. Another thing I'd say is like as you start to scale in your company, there's a lot of hype around it, and maybe hype is even a loaded word. Um, but there's some real enthusiasm and excitement about what it can do, and I think the potential there is real. But I think a lot of times unrealistic expectations are being formed by initial results, like how fast it set up a POC, um, and how fast it could, write certain ideas down or something like that. Because the real benefit isn't that it can output a lot of text quickly. It's the thought that's behind it. Did it make you think something different? Because a person is still going to have to go, the human in the loop is still going to have to go through and do the review, the very careful review. And even I would say a more careful review than any other review we've ever done before. Because the review is going to say, it's going to be tempting for us to think that AI is great and it gives good answers. It'll output tons and tons of information. We'll think it's complete. And do we really have the discipline to go through and review it carefully, not just for what it's there and is it actually accurate, but what is it missing still? And so we have to really engage our review muscles a lot more than we ever did before. When you had somebody who wrote something who was a human and they give it to you for review, it's a lot safer, I think, than an AI because humans will have very predictable human errors that we've learned to understand. But AI is an error pattern that we haven't really adapted to yet. And so that's why our reviews have to be uh, extra strong and extra diligent. So that's my current take on AI and using it is just get ready to review in a way that you've never had to review before. Um, so
Yeah. Super interesting. Thanks, Brian. We have one more question, which is, in your experience, what are the key indicators that a team has the wrong mix of automated versus manual tests?
okay, the wrong mix. I think you can look at some of the metrics like are customers finding too many defects, right? Are they finding important ones that cause us problems we have to do hot fixes for or something, right? So quality issues can be certainly a sign that you might need to change something in how the way that you're developing. But just like any metric, it should be the start of the conversation. It might point to the fact that you have not enough time to do deeper exploratory testing. It might point to the fact that your acceptance criteria tests aren't automated, and you're missing some of those automated tests, right? So depending on what kind of errors you're finding or where in the process that might be breaking down, right? Sometimes people will say like, it's not doing this. Well, and then you realize you never actually built it to do that. And so it's kind of a requirements problem. And so you need to figure out what's in your process that's missing a well thought out plan for your software. So yeah, use that customer reported defects and any other quality issues as a start of a conversation to start asking the whys, and it might point you to the test mix. So yeah, that's what I would say uh, to go to if you're trying to
Awesome.
figure out whether you have the wrong test mix. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. I hope that answers the question for the audience. So we are on to the last question of the day, which is what tips can help QA teams effectively communicate the rationale behind their testing strategy and propose changes to project leadership?
Yeah. So this is a challenge that we haven't necessarily addressed in the previous like challenges of changing over things. But I think primarily you want to know, I guess first of all, you want to know why you have what you have. So just understanding the excuses, the reasons, whatever you call it, the history behind it to understand, what situation you're in, and then clearly define what the end state is that you want, right? That's what's going to be, top leadership, strategy is, what do you want to get to? What value does that give us, right? The end state has to come along with the value for them, right? In this case, it's very easy. We're trying to reduce customer reported defects by doing a proper test mix. And we can show how it does that. Um, and we can show why it's important to not have customer reported defects. If you have a project that's had major scrambles, or you've had to recover from customer problems, like this would be a great case to say like, hey, let's look back at this and see, how's our test mix look and what do we want it to look like? So clearly define that end state, and then you have to know what the gaps are. How, you've looked at how you got to where you are. Now you want to look at where you want to go. There's a gap there. And then you have to know what the priority is in the plan for improving it. What are the specific steps that you hope to take in order to close those gaps to get where you want to go? That's a really good um, communication plan at an executive level. Is they want to know the bottom line and they want to know how to get there. And so, give them those kinds of tools. And hopefully, what we've talked about through here will give you a better idea of what that end state really is. Only you know where you've been and where you're at. But then when you know what the end state is or how to find it, then you can determine what the gaps might be. And some of the gaps might be test mix, like
Hmm.
your end state, right, of lower customer issues. Uh, some of that gap might be the test mix. If you want to take that individually, that's great. You might have other problems that you need to bring to your test leadership or your leadership and say like, yeah, well, test mix is a part of it, but we're having customer issues because of other things too. That'll come out from some of those metrics. Just paying attention, listening to what customers say. Um, and then, yeah, figuring out how to get there. That's the hard work. If it were easy to get there, somebody would have done it already, probably. So, yeah, making the plan and having it step by step so that they can see, you want leadership to be able to have confidence that if they invest in this, that it will actually get to where they need it to go. And so having a well thought out plan for that, um, is a good strategy for communicating it.
That's
So.
a insightful response, Brian. I think it's also about tying back to the business impact uh, along with the testing strategy, because I think the leadership also is, as you rightly said, right? I mean, they also want to see the why, and also not just the what, but also the why. And I think, of course, the clear game changer would, of course, be communication between the QA teams and the leadership and the business and multiple different stakeholders who are basically involved in it. Yeah. I did
Yeah,
promise that this would be the last question, but I just saw one more question from the audience. Is it okay if I go ahead with it?
of course. Yeah.
Great. So, with the rise of GenAI and agent-driven testing, do you see this changing the balance between automated and exploratory testing?
So it's just interesting. I think it will eventually. I don't
Hmm.
know that it's quite there yet, at least what I've seen so far. So, um, currently I went to a little conference a couple weeks ago about, you know, agent-driven testing. And to the point that it is right now, it's a little bit more of generating the code that's needed to perform a test, an automated test. And I think that this is one of the things that can be a tool for testers, in even in this space of getting the right test mix. So if you're in a company or situation where the developers aren't writing the tests, well, sometimes testers aren't the best at writing code, right? And so it might take us a long time to struggle through getting the acceptance criteria tests out of the way to give us time to do the exploratory testing that will really be needed in order to pave the way for the customer. And so this can be a game changer in the sense that like whether it be developers or testers, let's get those acceptance criteria working and out of the way. Like I said, we're gonna have to do the proper reviews. Did they get all of them? All that kind of stuff. But because acceptance criteria are a little bit more um, in the camp of let's just check the box, AI is getting pretty good at checking the box. If you've written out the acceptance criteria clearly in an organized way, it can do a pretty decent job at checking the boxes and write those. So use it, leverage it in order to be able to explore the application more. That would be, I think that would be a huge impact. Mhm.
Thanks so much for
I,
sharing that. Yeah, and we
yeah,
do
I
have,
wonder.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
go
See, there's
ahead.
another question, but I want to put in one last little note on
Yeah,
this question
of
though,
course.
because what can be behind this is sometimes some insecurity about testing jobs, and I think that comes
Mhm.
back to the mindset of like, are we doing automation so that we don't do manual testing anymore? And I think if the mindset is no, we're doing automated testing because we want to have more time to do better manual testing, then I don't think our jobs are at stake as testers. We until we have AI using the systems instead of users, well, then AI can test it for themselves, right? Um, so there's one other phase of generative AI that I think
Mhm.
could come down later, and that is I haven't seen it yet, but that's where you release Gen AI as a tester, as a manual tester, to like understand what a system is and try and perform what it thinks that system is offering. I haven't quite seen that yet. That would be an interesting next development. And that's where we still, as testers, have to understand like, does AI really know the context of that? Like the tester does, the industry, what the user is actually trying to accomplish. When it can do that, then I think it's a it's a more valuable tool as a generative AI. It may be possible that it could be leveraged for exploratory testing at some point. Um, haven't seen that yet though. So yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I think we have one more question, which is in your team, who owns the decision on the mix of manual versus automated tests? Are they QA engineers, developers, or leadership? And how do you resolve the conflicts in these priorities?
Yeah, it's usually when we are it's a conversation and we have a planning session or a grooming session where we talk about, what are the automated tests that we're going to have as part of the acceptance criteria. And the testers have their input in that conversation too to say, I think we should try this case. I'd like to automate this case. And then developers can say, well, that's not going to be a very automatable test, or, that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we would want in an ongoing regression test suite, for example. Um, and so it's usually just out of we come to consensus in those meetings about what makes the most sense. It I don't know that it ever has come down to like, you know, the person, I think in our company it would be the test manager who ultimately owns like what should be the automated versus written as a manual test. They have in our company, at least, it's the responsibility of the testers because of the regulatory requirements that we have. Um, there are certain things that we get to say, like, no, we need this automated for now. It has to be a part of it. Um, or we can get away with doing this as a manual test for now. But I think if the team is in alignment with what they're trying to do, with the end goal, then a lot of that stuff um, should kind of work out together, right? If developers don't want to write tests and they'd rather just have somebody else deal with it, which means a manual test, or they have to write it themselves, then it's not really a collaborative environment, right? So if it's just people trying to get out of work, then you need to agree on what it is that you're trying to accomplish and have some standards about how you're going to work together. So it's probably worth setting up some conversations to talk about what things in general we automate versus what things we test manually.
Thank you so much, Brian. And that was a very interesting response. And I'm sure that our audience would be able to take away a lot of insights today. As we wrap the conversation, just wanted to check if you have any parting, words for the audience.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I would say I didn't have anything prepared as like a closing remarks on that, but
Mhm.
I think hopefully this has been a helpful presentation in order to take a look at what your test mix is. I don't know that that's something we necessarily focus on very much, but um, understanding what the goals are of a proper test mix hopefully is helpful, and then you can get there. So keep at it, and happy testing.
Thanks, Brian. So I'd like to thank Brian for sharing his valuable expertise and insights with us. And of course, thank you to the audience for being a part of this session. As always, I think, we want to keep these conversations alive. So we would appreciate if you stay tuned for more such episodes. And, we'll make sure that we're bringing in more leaders who are reshaping the world of QA and technology like Brian. And of course, you can reach out to Brian over LinkedIn as well in case you have any other questions or want more insights. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. See you in the next session. Bye. Thanks once again, Brian.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.